In the heart of the Amazon, a lone inspector discovers something no one was ever meant to find. A century-old German train buried deep within the jungle. What was it doing there? And what secret did the forest try to hide for over 100 years? Watch till the end. You won't believe what he uncovered. Subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. The jungle was never silent, but that morning it felt muted, as if the air itself held its breath. Elias stood at the edge of the riverbank, watching a current of brown water carry fallen leaves downstream. The remnants of the last storm still lingered, broken branches, mud thick as tar, and a sky veiled in damp mist. For 3 nights, the rain had battered his small wooden hut, testing its seams, whispering through the cracks like something alive. He lived alone, deep in the Amazon, 100 kilometers from the nearest town. The forest had become his companion, his purpose, and sometimes his punishment. For 10 years, he had worked as a field inspector for the Environmental Patrol, a modest title that meant walking through endless green, measuring deforestation, marking illegal camps, and reporting whatever he found through a static-filled radio signal. Most days he spoke to no one. Silence had become the shape of his life. When the storm finally passed, Elias turned on his old generator and checked the satellite feed that his department used for forest monitoring. The image flickered, distorted by humidity before stabilizing into a pale blur of greens and browns. He was used to chaos on these maps. Storms carved scars through the forest all the time. But one detail froze him. Across a patch of untouched jungle, a line cut straight through the image. Not a river, not a ridge, perfectly straight. He zoomed in. The pixels bled into each other, but the line remained clean, geometric, impossible. The Amazon didn't make lines like that. Elias frowned. No road had ever been built in that sector. No record of logging, no abandoned concessions. His finger traced the coordinates on the worn map spread across the table. The spot lay deep inside a region marked as unexplored, far beyond any patrol route. For a moment, he thought it might be an error, some glitch in the data. But the unease in his gut told him otherwise. Curiosity was a dangerous thing in the jungle. It lured men into places that didn't want to be found. Yet staring at that straight mark on the screen, Elias felt something awaken inside him. An old hunger he had long forgotten. The need to know. That night, as rain whispered against the roof, he packed his gear. Machete, rope, compass, camera, notebook, dried meat, water tablets. He studied the map again, marking a rough route with charcoal. The journey would take at least 3 days, maybe 4 if the terrain had shifted after the storm. By dawn, the mist still clung low over the river. Tupa, his black dog, followed him to the edge of the clearing. "Stay," Elias murmured, running a hand through the animal's fur. The dog whined softly but obeyed. Elias shouldered his pack and stepped into the trees. The forest swallowed him within minutes. Sunlight broke into shards between branches, and the air thickened with heat. Each step sank into mud, releasing the rich scent of decay, the smell of life constantly devouring itself. His machete swung rhythmically, cutting through curtains of vines. The sound echoed like a heartbeat. Hours passed. Sweat soaked his shirt. Mosquitoes clouded his vision. By midday, he stopped to drink near a fallen tree, the only open space he had seen in miles. The forest around him hummed with the invisible pulse of insects. He checked his compass, still heading east. The coordinates pressed against his mind like a secret, waiting to be revealed. On the second day, the trail disappeared entirely. The terrain began to rise, and the roots of ancient trees twisted from the soil like bones. Elias moved slower now, guided only by instinct and the faint numbers on his compass. Once he stumbled on something metallic buried in mud, a rusted pipe or a drum. But when he scraped it clean, it looked older, almost handmade. He photographed it, marked the spot, and kept moving. By evening, exhaustion gripped his limbs. He strung his hammock between 2 trees near a small stream, lit a small fire, and ate in silence. The jungle glowed around him with 1,000 unseen eyes. In the distance, something howled long and low. He stared at the flames, thinking of the line on the map. It had seemed harmless then, just a pattern. Now it felt like a call. The third morning dawned pale and gray. Fog curled between the trees and droplets clung to every leaf. Elias packed quickly, his heartbeat steady but alert. The air had changed. He could smell it, a faint metallic tang beneath the usual scent of moss and soil. He pressed forward, cutting through one last curtain of hanging vines. Then he saw it. At first, he thought it was a cliff, a massive wall of iron and rust rising from the earth, strangled by roots. But as he stepped closer, the truth struck him with silent force. It wasn't a wall. It was a machine, a locomotive. The jungle parted before it like a curtain drawn back by time itself. The train towered over him, its body half swallowed by soil, its wheels embedded in the ground. Moss dripped from its roof. Vines hung like veins from its sides. The forest had tried to consume it and failed. Elias approached in disbelief. He reached out and touched the corroded metal. It was warm under his palm, rough with age. He traced a number barely visible beneath the rust. Hanover 1910, German, over a century old. But how? There were no rails, no paths, no records, no stories in any village about a train vanishing in the jungle. The thought made his skin prickle. This wasn't just an artifact. It was an impossibility. He stepped back, his eyes drinking in every detail. The broken headlamp, the jagged remains of a smokestack, the collapsed roof of a passenger car. The forest had not simply hidden the train. It had claimed it, turning it into part of itself. Elias felt something stir deep inside him. Not fear, not yet, but reverence. The jungle was a devourer of secrets, and somehow it had decided to share one with him. As the light faded, he built a small fire at the edge of the clearing. The flickering glow danced across the locomotive's surface, making it seem almost alive again. He sat cross-legged, staring at the machine, the questions multiplying faster than he could contain them. Who built it? How did it get here? And why had it been left behind? When he finally lay back to rest, the sound of the forest returned, frogs croaking, insects singing, branches cracking far away. But beneath it all, Elias thought he heard something else. A low, distant hum. The kind of sound a train makes before it begins to move. He told himself it was only the wind. And as sleep claimed him, the last thing he saw was the faint curve of an iron wheel glinting in the firelight, like an eye half open, watching. When Elias awoke, dawn had already begun filtering through the canopy, painting the air in pale green light. The jungle steamed with the breath of night, every leaf glistening. For a moment, he didn't move, unsure if what he had seen the day before had been real. Then his eyes found it again. The great locomotive, silent and immovable, its shape rising from the earth like the spine of a long-dead creature. He stood, his muscles stiff from sleep, and approached slowly. The smell of rust and wet moss filled his lungs. The forest was strangely quiet here. No bird calls, no insects, only the faint drip of water from leaves. The air itself felt heavy, as if the place demanded reverence. He circled the locomotive, tracing his hand along the corroded edges. Each rivet seemed to whisper of the past. The front of the engine bore a number plate so eroded that only fragments could be read. Hanover 1910. He whispered the date aloud, letting it hang in the damp air. 2 passenger cars stretched behind the engine. The first leaned to one side, its roof broken, half swallowed by roots as thick as a man's arm. The second was more intact, but sealed tight with vines and soil. Trees had grown through the windows, their trunks splitting the frames. It was as if the forest had decided to imprison the machine forever. Elias took a deep breath and stepped onto the bent metal of the first car. The structure creaked beneath his weight, and a flock of small birds burst from the roof in panic. He steadied himself, switched on his flashlight, and ducked inside. The interior was a corridor of ghosts. Shafts of sunlight cut through holes in the ceiling, catching on clouds of dust that shimmered in the beam. Rows of seats lined the sides, the leather long gone, replaced by green growth and fungus. Metal racks hung at odd angles, twisted by time. In one corner, a vine had grown through the floor, curling around a broken lamp like a snake claiming its prey. He moved slowly, careful not to disturb more than he must. The silence pressed against him, dense and alive. On the far wall, half hidden by mold, he found the remnants of a metal plaque. He scraped away the grime with his knife until faint letters emerged. Versuchsylnia, experimental line. The word sent a chill down his spine. Experimental line. What experiment could have brought a German train this deep into the Amazon? He photographed the plaque, then moved toward the rear of the car. There, beneath a mound of debris, something glinted faintly. He knelt, brushing aside the dirt with his hands. A small metal frame appeared, holding the brittle remains of a paper label. Only a few words were legible. Führerplan in Berlin. Fireplan, German again. He took the fragment carefully, slipping it into his pack. His flashlight flickered, and for a moment, the shadows shifted strangely across the walls. The vines seemed to move just slightly, like something breathing. Elias froze, heart hammering, until he realized it was only the slow sway of the trees outside. Still, the sensation lingered that he was not alone in the car. He forced himself onward, climbing out through a window frame to reach the second carriage. It stood upright, its side panel buckled, but still recognizable. The vines here were denser, woven together like ropes. He hacked through them with his machete until a narrow gap opened. The air that escaped was cold and dry, as if trapped for a century. Inside, darkness ruled. He turned on his flashlight again and stepped cautiously. The beam caught fragments of shattered glass, twisted pipes, and decayed wooden panels. The smell was different here. Not just rot, but something chemical, sharp, and metallic. Halfway through the car, the floor sagged under his weight. He crouched low, shifting his center of gravity, and noticed a circular object embedded between the boards. Pulling it free, he realized it was an old steam gauge. The glass cracked, but the needle still frozen at 0. Beneath the dirt, he could make out a faint inscription. Damp steam. He smiled faintly despite the unease curling in his stomach. This was proof beyond question. The machinery was authentic, early 20th century, untouched for decades. He set the gauge back down carefully, then moved toward the end of the car. That was when he noticed something peculiar. The wall at the rear wasn't entirely solid. A patch of rusted metal looked different, smoother, as if welded over something else. He tapped it lightly with the handle of his knife. A hollow echo answered. A hidden compartment. Elias knelt and brushed away the soil at its base. Beneath the grime, his fingers found the edge of a small handle fused in place by time. He pulled once. Nothing. Again, still nothing. The third time, the metal groaned and gave slightly, sending flakes of rust tumbling to the floor. He tried again, harder, until it moved an inch, then 2. The sound that followed was like a sigh, a rush of stale, cold air escaping the sealed space. Inside was darkness, thicker than the rest of the car, older somehow. He leaned closer, shining his light into the gap. The beam caught on metal shelves, glass, and something wrapped in canvas. His pulse quickened. It wasn't just an empty cavity. There was something stored there. He widened the gap carefully, but before he could reach inside, his flashlight flickered again and died completely. The car fell into darkness. For a moment, the jungle outside seemed to vanish. The silence became absolute. Then faintly somewhere deep in the structure something shifted. A slow, deliberate sound like weight settling after a long sleep. Elias froze. He didn't breathe, didn't move. The sound came again. Soft, dragging, metallic. Then it stopped. The forest exhaled, and the ordinary noises of insects returned as if nothing had happened. Elias swallowed hard and backed away. Whatever waited behind that sealed panel could wait another day. He would need better light, better tools. Outside, the sun had already begun to sink. Red light filtered through the trees, setting the rusted train aglow like a dying ember. He stood before it for a long time, wiping sweat and grime from his face, his heart still thudding. The plaque's words echoed in his mind. Experimental line. As the first stars began to appear, Elias set up his small campfire near the edge of the clearing. The flames licked at the damp air, crackling softly. Across from him, the train loomed, immense, lifeless, and yet somehow awake. He ate in silence, the taste of metal still in his mouth. He thought of sending a report to headquarters, but the words refused to form. This wasn't a violation or a discovery that fit into a line on a government form. This was something else. Something the forest had hidden for a century and had now decided to show him. When he finally lay down, the forest chorus rose again. Frogs, cicadas, nightbirds. Yet beneath it all, Elias could have sworn he heard a sound that didn't belong. A faint ticking. Slow, rhythmic, almost mechanical, like the heartbeat of the jungle itself. Elias left the jungle 2 days later. Though every step away from the train felt like betrayal, the forest had swallowed the path he'd cut through, as if trying to erase his intrusion. He carried only a few things in his pack: the photograph of the plaque, the broken gauge, and the scrap of German paper he had found inside the carriage. But the image of the locomotive haunted him like an echo he couldn't silence. The small town of San Miguel looked almost unreal after so many weeks alone. Noise, color, movement. Everything seemed too fast, too bright. Elias checked into a low guest house near the river, where the air smelled of diesel and fried fish. That night, he sat by the window, staring at the fragment of paper under lamplight. The word Berlin glowed faintly in faded ink. He couldn't sleep. He needed answers. The next morning, he went to the regional university, hoping someone there might help him identify what he had found. The archives were housed in a building older than anyone who worked inside it. Cracked walls, slow ceiling fans, and the scent of old paper that clung to everything. A librarian named Duarte listened patiently as Elias described the locomotive, the German inscriptions, and the hidden chamber. The man didn't laugh, though disbelief flickered in his eyes. "You're saying there's a train from Germany sitting in the middle of the Amazon?" "I saw it with my own eyes," Elias said quietly. "And it's not just a train. It was something else. A laboratory, maybe." Duarte leaned back, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "There was an old story. My grandfather mentioned it once about a German expedition before the Great War. They came here searching for something in the rainforest. Plants, I think. Medicinal ones. What happened to them? No one knows. The jungle kept them." The librarian rose and led Elias down a narrow hall into a room filled with dust and forgotten documents. He pulled out a box labeled Foreign Expeditions 1900-1920. Inside were brittle folders, yellowed photos, and hand-drawn maps. Duarte handled them like relics. After a few minutes, he found something. A map of northern Brazil marked with a faint red line. Along the route, a name was written in neat German script. Project Eisenbahn. Lena. Elias's pulse quickened. Railway Project Lena. He whispered. Duarte nodded slowly. It was never finished. Supposedly, they wanted to build a rail connection through the forest for transport and research, but the war broke out. Funding ended, and the record stopped. It was said that the lead scientists stayed behind in the jungle. Some claimed they were gathering rare plants that could change medicine forever. Others said they went mad. Elias photographed the map and thanked Duarte, though the man warned him to be careful. "If what you found is part of that project, it might be better left buried," he said. "Those men were experimenting with things no one understood back then, and maybe no one should now." But Elias couldn't let go. That night, in his room, he spread his notes across the table. The plaque, the gauge, the photos, the coordinates. A pattern began to emerge. The location of the locomotive matched almost perfectly with the endpoint of the red line on the German map. He searched online for the phrase Versuchszielnähe. The results were few, mostly fragments of old German journals. One archived by a European university, translated roughly to Zielnähe Project, research on longevity through plant symbiosis. Another mentioned biochemical trials conducted in isolated field environments. Longevity, symbiosis, isolation. The words made his skin crawl. He printed what little he could find and continued digging. Soon he came across a name, Dr. Erich Langmann, head biochemist of the Zielnähe expedition, last reported in 1913, missing in the Amazon basin. The following day, he took his findings to an elderly professor in the university's linguistics department, Dr. Alvarez, who specialized in historical German. The professor examined the photographs and papers for a long while before speaking. "This term Versuchszielnähe," Alvarez said, tapping the image of the plaque, was indeed used by a secret division of German research at that time. They focused on botanical adaptation, plants capable of surviving in extreme conditions. Some believed such plants might extend human life, strengthen immunity. Wild theories. He looked up. But if they sent an entire train into the jungle, it wasn't just theory. Elias sat back, the weight of the revelation pressing on him. Why would they come here? Why so far from home? Because the jungle is the last place anyone looks, Alvarez said softly. And because it hides things from governments, from enemies, from time. That evening, Elias walked along the riverbank, the map in his hand. The sun bled red over the water, and the wind carried the faint smell of wet soil. He imagined the German scientists more than a century ago arriving with their machines, their equipment, their ambitions. What had they found out there? And what had found them? His curiosity burned hotter than fear now. He knew he would go back. He had to see the hidden chamber again. As he packed his bag, a thought crossed his mind that refused to leave. What if the train had not simply been abandoned? What if it had been sealed deliberately? The next morning, Elias boarded a cargo boat heading upstream. The forest thickened around them as the sun rose. He watched the green walls close in, the water dark as ink, and the sounds of civilization fade behind him. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became, thick with the breath of something ancient. Somewhere ahead, beneath a century of vines and silence, waited the truth, the legacy of a forgotten science. And though Elias didn't yet understand it, by returning, he was about to awaken something that had been sleeping far too long. The river bore him back like a slow-moving thought. Elias sat low in the canoe while the outboard muttered, the banks sliding past in wavering walls of green. Clouds gathered and broke, turning the water from bronze to slate and back again. He had slept little since leaving San Miguel. The words he'd copied from the journals refused to quiet. Longevity, symbiosis, isolation. Each seemed to lean against the other. Forming a door he could not stop himself from opening. He reached the landing near his hut at dusk, shouldered his pack, and climbed the familiar rise with a heaviness that didn't come from weight. Inside, he laid out the tools he'd promised himself the train deserved. A stronger lamp, spare batteries sealed in waxed paper, a brush for delicate surfaces, a length of cord, a small pry bar, clean cloth, plastic sleeves. He worked without music, without radio, as if sound might carry the secret away. When night settled, he lay on the cot, eyes open to the darkness, the jungle's breath slow against the shutter slats. He told himself he would move at first light. He left before the birds found their voices. The path he'd cut was mostly gone, the forest already knitting itself. Vines lay across the trail like doubts. It took him longer this time, not because he was unsure of the way, but because the certainty of it unnerved him. As he walked, he felt watched, not stalked, not threatened, but observed with the kind of attention the forest reserved for storms and fires. By afternoon, the air changed, that faint metallic tang again, threaded through the scent of wet bark. The trees thinned to the memory of a clearing. He pushed aside a curtain of leaves and stepped into the place that had been waiting. The locomotive crouched where he had left it, a dark hump beneath a pale sky. Rain had rinsed the rust to a deeper orange. Orchids had burst along a seam in the roof like small flames. Elias stood still, catching his breath, listening. Silence, then the smallest sounds. A drop, a wing, a leaf sighing in heat. He crossed to the first carriage and felt the old stutter of awe when his palm met iron. "I'm back," he said absurdly, and the word fell into the clearing and did not return. He went first to the second car, to the welded panel whose hollow voice had answered his knife. The vines had thickened over it, a shallow weave. He teased them aside and cleaned the seam with the brush. The handle was where he'd left it, fused and stubborn. He braced the pry bar, leaned, breathed, and leaned again. The metal groaned like a thing waking. Flakes came away in red powder. He set the lamp at his feet, light thrown up across the wall, and worked until the seam surrendered. Cold air exhaled into his face, dry and mineral, as if a cellar had been sealed from weather for a century. He widened the opening just enough to slip through. Darkness swallowed him 2 steps in, and the lamp's beam caught shelves, real ordered shelves running the length of a narrow chamber. On them, boxes strapped with rusted bands, satchels lined in oilcloth, a metal tube the color of old coins. Elias held the light over each in turn. The closest crate bore a faint stencil, almost gone, but tarnishes material. 1911. He rested a hand on the wood, as if greeting a stranger whose name he already knew. Carefully, he slid the pry bar beneath the banding. The crate sighed when it opened, the smell rising like a preserved season. Resin, paper, something floral long since translated into dust. Inside, the straw had collapsed into a brittle nest, and in the nest lay glass, jars, and vials, each with a label written in script so precise he could see the pressure of the pen strokes. Unbeckant Region 4. Alkaloid spurin. Unknown. Traces of alkaloids, a dozen more named and numbered, some with Latin binomials, some with only a question mark, as if taxonomy itself had hesitated. He lifted one jar to the light. Amber resin held a coil of root like a fossilized vein, not glowing. No trick of mysticism, just a quality of captured light that made the thing appear mid-breath. He set it back gently and wrapped the crate's edge in cloth to keep the wood from crumbling further. The copper tube lay against the wall where the straw had not reached. He unscrewed the cap and eased out the roll inside. Paper slid free with the soft rasp of shed skin. Maps, 3, maybe 4 layered with annotations. A main sheet showed a sweep of the basin rendered in the meticulous hand of a surveyor. Rivers. Elevations, a thin red line pushing into interior blankness. Along that line, points were circled and numbered. In the margin, a legend. Samelpunkt collection points. Besides several pencil marks darker than the rest, as if someone had pressed harder there. One circle had been traced twice, then again here. He spread the map on the chamber floor, weighting corners with whatever wouldn't damage it. His lamp hummed faintly. He traced the route with his finger, measuring against memory, and felt the faint drift of vertigo that comes when history aligns with the present. Every point corresponded to places he knew by texture and smell rather than name. A drowned oxbow, a ridge that caught the first wind, a hollow where fog lay stubborn till noon. The thought rose uninvited. It isn't only that they were here. It's that they understood the forest enough to move like this in small, deliberate steps. He turned a second page, not a map, but a table. Columns of dates, coordinates, conditions, temp 34 to 36, feucht, hoch, humidity high, Blutsicht, variable. Notes marched in German down the side, clipped and ungenerous. Twice a word broke the neutrality. Potential underline Nick T. Len, do not share. The lamp's beam drifted and found near the end of the shelf a case of instruments, calipers, folded lenses and nickel frames, a hand scale still zeroed. In another, slides wrapped in cotton, the glass fogged but intact. It was an order made by people who expected to return to it. An order interrupted not by panic, but by a decision that left things in place and left the place closed. He stood and felt the press of the air. The chamber was so quiet that his breath sounded intrusive. On a lower shelf, he found a field book bound in canvas, its spine stiff. The first pages were nothing but measurements and the shorthand of fieldwork. On the fourth, a phrase in a different hand caught him. Symbiose versuch in situ or folk Enkler symbiosis trial in situ. Outcome unclear. The entry ended there. The next skipped ahead a week, then 3. The writing thinned. The last page was a single line. Rare fat for tact. Return postponed. He closed the book and listened. The living forest above felt impossibly far. Down here, time had pulled and settled like cold water. Elias returned the notebook to its shelf, slid the maps back into the tube, sealed the cap by habit more than hope. He took photographs, slow, deliberate, the flash smothered by the absorber of a century, and then he turned off the lamp. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then the world's other sounds came back in. Soil shifting, a distant drip, the faint tick of cooling metal that hadn't felt heat in a lifetime. When he climbed into the carriage's stale light again, afternoon had already leaned toward evening. He sat on the sill, the iron biting through his trousers, and felt the tremor in his hands subside. The forest's chorus returned one instrument at a time. A single cicada, then 2, the rasp of a leaf-litter lizard, the weightless sweep of a bat. He drank warm water and stared at the hatch. The certainty of what he'd found did not thrill him. It sobered him. He hauled his small tarp to the edge of the clearing and strung it low. The first stars fought through the canopy. He unrolled the maps and held his lamp beneath, skin pricking as insects crashed against the glass. The red line ran like a quiet intention through the green. He laid his own notes beside it. Again and again, the points matched stretches of land now labeled, protected on government charts, reserves whose borders had been drawn. He realized an ignorance of this older geometry. He looked up, and for a moment the clearing seemed surrounded not by trees, but by a listening. He had felt watched earlier. Now he felt held not by a gaze exactly by a patience. He tried to imagine what would happen if he sent these coordinates to the office, to the university, to anyone whose job it was to care. Helicopters. He thought drones. Teams in clean boots with gloves and permits and promises. The idea came with the force of a smell. Diesel and water, ash on leaves. He shut his eyes and pressed his palms to them until light shattered behind his lids. Knowledge wanted to move. That was its nature. But every instinct he had left told him that movement here would be not a continuation, but a wound. He lowered his hands, and the light from the lamp swam back into focus. On the nearest sapling, a vine had curled in a shape he recognized too precise to be coincidence. In the yellow edge of the beam, the leaves were elliptical with a serration that bent inward, not out the exact geometry he had seen earlier in a jar labeled unbeckoned. He reached toward it and stopped short. The leaf was ordinary, dull, green. He did not touch it. He did not write it down. He found himself speaking aloud the way he sometimes did to Tupa when the nights were long. "If I show them, they will come," he said. "If they come, they will not leave." The sentence sounded naive in the clearing, almost theatrical. Yet it was the truth in his mouth, heavy as a stone. He rolled the maps and slid them into his pack. The forest answered with no opinion he could detect. Sleep came in pieces. Rain drifted in before midnight, a fine sheet that made the tarp hum as if tuned. In one of the fragments of his dreaming, Elias stood on a platform and watched a train arrive without rails, breathing steam that smelled of crushed leaves and iron filings. Someone at his shoulder spoke German in a voice he almost recognized. He turned and woke with the words still hanging above him like a thread he could not gather back. He rose before dawn, the world around him the color of wet ash. He did not go back into the chamber. He did not open any more boxes. He sat with the locomotive a long time in the thinning dark and practiced the act of leaving. When the sky finally separated into layers, charcoal, then slate, then damp pearl, he stood and packed with the methodical quiet of a man who doesn't trust his hands. At the edge of the clearing, he stopped and looked back. The orchids on the roof had closed for night and were only now beginning to loosen, small mouths brightening. The machine crouched like a monument to a certainty that had never existed. He lifted 2 fingers in a gesture that was not a salute and not a farewell. Then he entered the green and let the forest draw the curtain behind him. The walkout cost him more than the walk-in. The red line on the map had felt like a rail beneath his feet. Now each step landed on something older and softer. Branches snagged his sleeves and let go. Thorns caught and broke. When he reached the river, the world's wider sound returned. Water working at stone, birds bargaining for the day, and the tightness in his chest eased by half. At the hut, he lit the lamp and set the copper tube on the table. The maps lay inside as if asleep. He washed his hands, though nothing visible stained them, and dried them on the same cloth he always used for his camera lens. The hut breathed with the river's damp. The window's thin curtains stirred like a pulse. He opened his journal and wrote only a date, then closed it again. Words would not protect this. Neither would silence alone. He cleared a place in the corner and pulled up a floorboard he had replaced himself the year he moved in. Beneath the joists were dry. He stared into the space for a long time, measuring the thought against the room. No, not here. Too near. Too easy to find by accident. He reseated the board and tied the tube shut in cloth, then wrapped it again in waxed paper, then again until it lay in his hands like a bundled instrument. He waited for morning light that was not just gray, but gold. He took the canoe upriver where the bank threw a bowl of roots into deep water and the current admitted a quiet eddy. He tied off and slid into the shallows. The mud took him up to the shin, cool and absolute. Beneath the overhang, a pocket had been carved where floods had worked for years. He dug there with his hands, not to bury, but to place. He set stones around the bundle the way he would pack a fire, so that it would breathe but not spread. Moss went over stone, silt over moss. The river's skin laid back down. When he straightened, the sun had crested the bend. The light cut the water into ribbons. He was tired in a way different from walking, a tiredness he knew would not leave. He sat in the canoe and let the current nudge him before he started the motor. For a long time, he did not look away from the place. On the porch that evening, the lamp off, the radio silent, Elias listened until listening turned back into hearing. The forest took its patience from him and made it larger. He could still draw the red line if asked. He could still find the clearing and sleep. But the decision had already been made, not as an act of will, but as a kind of agreement with something older than his wanting. He did not imagine he had saved anything. He hoped only that he had not invited the wrong kind of attention. In the dark, the rain started again with the delicacy of first pages. He let it ride on the roof. The choice settled in his bones like a weather change. Somewhere upriver, Beneath roots and mud and a steady seam of cold, the copper waited without impatience. In the heart of the jungle, iron slept. Between them, a man had placed himself and then stepped aside. Dawn would come as it always did. Green filtered through green. And when it did, Elias would still be here, closer to the end of something and nearer to peace than he had been. Than the day before. Weeks passed before Elias allowed himself to return to the place where river and silence met. The jungle had reclaimed his path. Vines crossed his doorway as if to remind him of his decision. In San Miguel, rumors had begun. Someone had seen a foreign train buried in the forest. Someone else, a ghost engine breathing fog at dusk. He said nothing. He still woke some nights to the sound of metal cooling. But when morning came, he did not reach for the maps. They were gone now, sealed beneath mud and roots where light and greed could not reach. He spent his days patrolling again, repairing fences, reporting rainfall, collecting soil samples. To the people upriver, he was only the quiet inspector with the tired eyes. Yet every rust-colored stone, every orchid flowering from decay, reminded him of that hidden machinery. The forest seemed different now, less backdrop, more presence. When he paused to drink, he felt it watching, measuring him with the same patience it had shown the locomotive. One afternoon, he followed a survey team sent by the ministry. They were clearing space for a new eco-tourist trail. The youngest, a boy with clean boots, asked why he kept frowning at the compass. Elias pointed toward a ridge thick with mahogany. Because some lines, he said, shouldn't be drawn. The boy laughed, thinking it a joke. That night, the rain came early, drowning their campfire. Elias lay awake, listening to the water, imagining it washing the red dust from steel, sealing everything again. In his hut, the radio sometimes crackled with news of corporations seeking patents for rare Amazonian species, new enzymes, new cures. Each headline tightened his chest. He wondered if silence could truly protect what he had seen, or if the forest would eventually reveal it to someone else. Perhaps that was the test. Not whether the secret would endure, but who would deserve to hear it. As the wet season deepened, fever took him. For days, he drifted between waking and dream, hearing the jungle breathe through the cracks in his walls. In one dream, he stood on rails of light cutting through green darkness, the locomotive whole again, its boiler pulsing like a heart. Figures moved inside, men in old uniforms, notebooks glowing faintly in their hands. One turned to him, face indistinct, and said a single word, "Be Warren. Preserve." Then the train dissolved into leaves. When the fever broke, he knew what he had to do. He gathered his journals, the photographs, the notes he'd made about the experiment. At dawn, he carried them to the river and fed each page to the current. The paper darkened, softened, and slipped beneath the surface. The water carried his handwriting away without a ripple. That evening, he sat on his porch, weak but calm, watching bats wheel above the trees. The jungle's noise rose and fell, a language he no longer tried to translate. He whispered thanks to the river, to the iron heart sleeping beneath roots, to the patience that had let him witness it once and still choose silence. The forest accepted the words without ceremony. Years later, travelers would find his hut empty. Inside, dust lay thick on the table, and under it, a single line was carved into the wood. A curve, gentle and unbroken, vanishing into nothing. Outside, vines had braided across the roof, binding it to the earth. Far upriver, storms shifted the banks, exposing for a moment the bronze glint of a buried tube before the mud closed again. And deep in the green interior where no path reached, a hush gathered around a mound of rusting steel. Sometimes when the wind tunneled through the canopy, it carried a sound not quite like thunder, slow, rhythmic, distant. The people of the river called it the old train breathing. But Elias, wherever his spirit had gone, knew it for what it was. The forest, remembering its promise. Some secrets aren't meant to be revealed. Deep in the jungle, the old train still sleeps. And when the wind moves through the trees, some say it breathes. If you felt the mystery, leave a comment below. Subscribe for more unbelievable true-style stories that will keep you watching till the end. Till the E.